On July 16, 1969, about 600 million people around the world watched as NASA launched Apollo 11.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Neil Armstrong was the first person to step onto the moon's surface.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But what if it was all fake? What if it was filmed in a studio and NASA never really went to the moon? Apollo 11 took off from Cape Kennedy, which is on the east coast of Florida. The astronauts on board were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The total cost of the Apollo 11 mission was approximately $385 million. This is roughly equivalent to $2.7 billion today. Armstrong and Aldrin spent about 21 hours on the moon's surface. By July 18th, Armstrong and Aldrin checked the lunar module and sent the first color TV pictures from space. On July 19th, Apollo 11 entered the moon's orbit and made its first adjustment to get on the right path for landing. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin got ready for the moon landing. Armstrong famously stepped onto the moon first, and Aldrin followed, making history with Armstrong's words,
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
"Oh, wait a minute, what about the flag? It looks like it's waving in the wind. How is that possible when the moon has no air? And why aren't there any stars in the sky? With no atmosphere to block their light, shouldn't the photos be full of stars?" Then there's the famous C rock. Some people say it's a movie prop with a letter C on it, suggesting that the moon rocks might be fake. Also, why do the shadows in the photos look so strange and uneven? And what about the astronaut footprints? They look too clear and detailed for a place with such weak gravity. But that's not all. Some people think the Apollo astronauts couldn't have survived the intense radiation in space, especially from the Van Allen belts, and others believe the moon landings were faked to win the space race or distract from other problems. Could all these doubts really mean the landings were faked? Or is there a simpler explanation for each of these mysteries? Before answering that question, it's important to know why NASA started the moon mission. It was because of the Cold War. After World War II, the US and the Soviet Union began a competition known as the Cold War. Here's how it all began. In the 1950s, Americans were enjoying a normal life. The country focused more on everyday items like cars and refrigerators rather than on war equipment after World War II. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was making significant strides in nuclear technology. In October 1957, the Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit using their R-7 rocket. Sputnik was an 83-kilogram sphere with a beeping radio transmitter. Just 2 days later, the Soviets tested a powerful thermonuclear bomb. This made America very nervous. Prompted by this, the United States tried to launch its first satellite in December 1957 with the Vanguard rocket. They aimed to send a tiny 1.46-kilogram satellite into orbit, but the launch failed, which was very embarrassing for America. However, they didn't give up. In 1958, using the Juno I rocket, they successfully launched a satellite, which was a major victory for the US. Following this success, America established NASA to lead the country's space programs, and NASA recruited its first 7 astronauts. By 1959, the US had attempted to launch 20 satellites, but only 8 were successful. The competition intensified when Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union became the first person in space on April 12, 1961. Gagarin was launched into orbit in the Vostok 1 spacecraft. In just 108 minutes, Vostok 1 completed 1 orbit and safely returned to Earth. At that time, NASA was working on Project Mercury. They had selected 7 astronauts, known as the Mercury 7, who quickly became national heroes. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard made history as the first American to travel into space. His flight didn't orbit the Earth. It was a short suborbital trip lasting just 15 minutes and reached a height of 187 kilometers. The main goal was to see if humans could survive and work in space. Seeing the success of the Soviet Union, President John F. Kennedy promised in a famous speech that the U.S. would land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
At that time, there was no clear path to reaching the moon, so NASA had to start from scratch. Following Mercury, the Gemini missions began. These missions were crucial in preparing for a moon landing. Gemini missions involved 2 astronauts and lasted longer than the Mercury flights. The astronauts practiced essential skills needed for a moon landing, like spacewalking and docking spacecraft. With the knowledge gained from Mercury and Gemini, NASA was ready to tackle its most ambitious goal, landing a human on the moon, which led to the Apollo program. To build public support for the Apollo program, President Kennedy gave the famous moon speech on September 12, 1962. He said, "We choose to go to the moon, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." This speech inspired Americans and made the moon landing a national goal.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
To achieve this, NASA needed advanced technology. With the moon about 400,000 kilometers away, they chose the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR method. This involved launching a spacecraft with 3 parts: the command module, service module, and lunar module. The command module supported 3 astronauts with basic needs. The service module provided oxygen, water, fuel, and power. While the command and service module, CSM, orbited the moon, the lunar module was used for landing and taking off from the moon's surface. The lunar module stayed in lunar orbit after the mission. Apollo 1, originally called Apollo 204, was supposed to be the first crewed mission in NASA's Apollo program, which aimed to land humans on the moon. The mission was planned for launch on February 21, 1967, with astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. But on January 27, 1967, during a routine pre-flight test, a fire broke out inside the command module. The pure oxygen environment inside made the fire spread quickly. Tragically, the astronauts couldn't escape in time, and they lost their lives.
Hey! I'm too far in the cockpit.
After the Apollo 1 tragedy, NASA focused on unmanned missions to test and improve the spacecraft. They conducted Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6 as unmanned flights to ensure everything was working properly before launching crewed missions again. Apollo 7, launched on October 11, 1968, was the first crewed mission of the Apollo program after the Apollo 1 tragedy. This mission was crucial for testing the redesigned command module. It lasted 11 days, with astronauts Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walter Cunningham aboard. During this mission, the astronauts conducted the first live TV broadcast from space. They successfully orbited the Earth 163 times. 2 months after the December 21, 1968 launch of Apollo 8, with astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, Apollo 8 became the first spacecraft to orbit the moon, allowing humans to see the moon up close and Earth from a great distance.
Actually coast all the way to the moon.
And after a while, you could look back and see the Earth getting smaller and smaller.
They spent 6 days in space, orbiting the moon 10 times. This mission provided valuable data and images, including the famous Earthrise photograph.
We were busy shooting pictures of the lunar surface for lunar landing sites for upcoming lunar landings. And then suddenly I looked out the window and here was this gorgeous orb coming up, and I thought, holy.
With only 1 year left in the 1960s and the deadline approaching, NASA needed to send a human to the moon before the decade ended. Apollo 9, launched on March 3, 1969, was crucial for testing the lunar module LM in Earth orbit. Astronauts James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweickart spent 10 days in space. They tested the LM systems, including docking, which is used to joining the 2 spacecraft, and undocking, which is used to separating the 2 spacecraft procedures, with the command module. Apollo 10, launched on May 18, 1969, at 11:14, Apollo 10's mission was a full dress rehearsal for the moon landing, excluding the actual landing. Astronauts Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan orbited the moon for 8 days. The mission tested all procedures and equipment needed for landing, including the lunar module's descent, the process of traveling from lunar orbit to the moon's surface, and ascent, the process of launching from the moon's surface back to lunar orbit. When Apollo 10 reached the moon's orbit as planned, Commander Stafford and lunar module pilot Cernan moved from the command module to the lunar module. They separated it from the rest of the spacecraft to carry out tests while orbiting the moon. The lunar module, named Snoopy, orbited the moon for about 8 hours. While the lunar module was on the far side of the moon, something strange happened. The astronauts lost contact with NASA's mission control on Earth, and they heard a mysterious sound. When the recording of this sound was later made public, some people said it was just interference between the radios of the lunar module and the command module, while others thought it might be proof of alien presence.
Used to keep it sound outer spacey, doesn't it? Do you hear that whistling sound?
The astronauts ignored the strange sound and continued their mission. They got as close as 9 miles to the moon's surface, but didn't land. Instead, they tested the lunar module's ability to descend toward the moon and then return to the command module. However, when the astronauts started the lunar module's ascent engine to return, it suddenly went out of control and began spinning wildly. Before they could understand what was happening, Commander Stafford saw a yellow gimbal lock light on the panel, meaning the computer was close to losing its sense of direction in space. This was a serious problem that could have turned the mission into a disaster and cost the lives of the 2 astronauts in the lunar module. But miraculously, Commander Stafford regained control just 2 seconds before disaster. After narrowly avoiding this disaster, the lunar module returned to orbit around the moon and reconnected with the command and service module. The astronauts moved back to the command module. According to the plan, they needed to return to Earth. Before leaving, they had to separate the lunar module and leave it in the moon's orbit. But the challenges didn't stop. When the astronauts separated the lunar module from the command and service module, a technical problem caused the lunar module to veer off course. NASA was worried that the fast-moving lunar module might crash into Apollo 10, so they manually fired its engine to push it away. The lunar module's engine kept burning until it ran out of fuel. After that, the lunar module drifted into space, and NASA lost contact with it. For decades, there was no sign of Apollo 10's lunar module. But almost 50 years later, in 2018, scientists saw an object passing close to Earth in space. At first, they thought it was an asteroid, but later they found out it was the same lunar module from Apollo 10, which had been drifting through space since 1969. Despite many difficulties, Apollo 10 was a successful mission. The astronauts completed all the tasks without landing on the moon and returned safely to Earth. Now, humanity was just one step away from reaching the moon, and that step was Apollo 11, which was scheduled to make history 50 days after Apollo 10's mission ended. On July 16, 1969, people all over the world watched as the massive Saturn V rocket, taller than a 36-story building and weighing over 3 million kilograms, launched from Merritt Island, Florida. This powerful rocket was carrying the Apollo 11 mission. At 9:32 a.m., the rocket took off with a thunderous roar, and millions of people cheered as it soared into space. After reaching Earth's orbit, Apollo 11 separated from the rocket and headed toward the moon. The mission was led by Neil Armstrong, with Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins as his crew. Armstrong and Aldrin were in the lunar module, which was designed to land on the moon, while Collins stayed in the command module orbiting the moon. 3 days later, on July 19, 1969, Apollo 11 reached the moon's orbit about 400,000 kilometers from Earth. Armstrong and Aldrin moved from the command module to the lunar module. After a few hours, the lunar module separated from the command and service module, which stayed in orbit with Collins. The lunar module began its descent toward the moon. NASA had selected 5 possible landing sites to ensure a safe landing. The lunar module's computer was programmed to land automatically, but just minutes before landing, 2 big problems arose. The lunar module started moving faster because some leftover pressure wasn't released properly. This made it go quicker than planned. Armstrong realized they were heading towards a dangerous spot full of big rocks. Before he could act, 2 warning alarms, 1201 and 1202, went off. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew what these alarms meant, so they asked Mission Control. Mission Control told them to keep going because the alarms were caused by the computer being overloaded, but it wasn't a serious issue. Even with the alarms, the lunar module's automatic landing system was still working. But when they got to about 150 meters above the surface, Armstrong took manual control. He saw the original landing area was too risky because of the large rocks. With only 5% fuel left, Mission Control started a countdown to decide whether to land or abort.
We're critical fuel state, and that's why the 60-second call was given, and then the 30-second call.
At this critical moment, Armstrong steered the module to a safer spot. With just a few seconds of fuel remaining, he managed to land safely on the moon. After a tense few moments, Armstrong's voice came over the radio. "Tranquility Base here."
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Neil Armstrong's famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," were broadcast live to 650 million people.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Buzz Aldrin joined him on the lunar surface. The two spent about 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon, walking, collecting samples, and setting up experiments. During their time on the moon, they left behind many symbolic and scientific items. Besides the famous American flag, which fell over when the lunar module took off, the astronauts left a metal plaque with signatures from the Apollo 11 crew and President Nixon. They also left symbolic items, such as an Apollo 1 mission patch to honor astronauts who died in a launch rehearsal fire, 2 medals for Soviet cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov, who died in separate accidents, a small silicon disc with goodwill messages from 73 countries and NASA staff, a gold olive branch symbolizing global peace. The astronauts left scientific instruments too, like a seismometer that measured moon vibrations but stopped working after 3 weeks due to extreme temperatures. Another experiment was the Lunar Laser Retroreflector, still used today to measure the Earth-Moon distance by reflecting laser beams back to Earth. They also left rock samples, a pole for measuring solar wind, and a lot of discarded equipment, including the black and white camera that broadcast their moonwalk. One of the most memorable things they left behind is their footprints. They also collected 23 kilograms of moon rock. After completing their mission on the surface, it was time to return. As they ascended from the moon's surface, the exhaust from the lunar module's engine knocked over the American flag they had planted. Once they reconnected the lunar module to the command module, their journey back to Earth began. The plan was to detach the service module before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, as only the command module could safely handle the re-entry. However, there was a risk that the service module's debris could hit the command module. To prevent this, NASA had installed thrusters to push the service module away, but these thrusters failed, causing the module to break apart as they re-entered. Fortunately, none of the debris struck the command module, and the astronauts safely made it back to Earth. The mission was so dangerous that the chances of the astronauts returning alive were very less. That's why President Richard Nixon prepared 2 speeches, one for a successful return and another titled "In Event of Moon Disaster," in case they didn't make it back. Thankfully, the command module descended safely into the ocean, and all 3 astronauts were rescued by ships. The astronauts were quarantined for 3 weeks to ensure they had not brought back any harmful viruses from the moon. With news about it spreading worldwide, the promise made by President Kennedy to land on the moon was finally fulfilled.
In 1969, the public had little reason to question mankind's historic first step on the moon. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race.
It's sad to think that when Apollo 11 succeeded, the president who started it all, John F. Kennedy, wasn't there to see it. To honor him, NASA named the launch site Kennedy Space Center. While many celebrated this achievement, others weren't convinced. There are still a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding the moon landing. With so many ideas, it's easy to get confused. Some people think the landing was faked to win the Cold War against the Soviets, but many of these theories have already been proven false. One big question is why the American flag seems to be waving on the moon. There's no air on the moon, so how can a flag wave? The flag was made with a horizontal rod along the top to make it look like it's waving. Without air, the flag wouldn't move on its own. During the Apollo 11 mission, the rod didn't fully extend, which made the flag ripple. This effect is only noticeable when the astronauts are moving or planting the flag. When they're not touching it, the flag stays still. Another theory is that the lack of stars in the moon photos proves the landing was fake. In reality, the moon landing happened during the day on the moon. The bright sunlight was too strong for the cameras of that time to capture the faint light from distant stars. Just like on Earth, where stars aren't visible in daylight photos, the bright sunlight on the moon made the stars too dim to be seen. Some people think the shadows in the moon photos don't line up because the landing was filmed with fake lighting. But the moon's surface is uneven, and the sun's light creates shadows that look different from what we see on Earth. The odd angles of the shadows are because of the moon's varied terrain, not because of studio lights. A common question is about the photo of Neil Armstrong stepping down from the lunar module module, which shows Armstrong's reflection with a camera in his hand. There were several cameras on the lunar module to capture different moments. Even though some people still doubt it, there is strong evidence that the moon landings were real. Historical records, and even the Soviet Union, which was in a space race with the US, confirmed that the landings actually happened. Since Apollo 17 in 1972, humans haven't gone back to the moon. Some think this means the landings were fake. In truth, the Apollo missions were very expensive and used a lot of resources. The focus shifted to other space projects like the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. Even though the moon landings faced criticism and were costly, they led to big advancements like improvements in computer technology. The demand for computer chips during the Apollo program helped lower their price and led to their widespread use. Even though we haven't been to the moon in over 50 years, NASA plans to return. The Artemis program aims to send astronauts back to the moon by 2025-2026, including the first woman and the first person of color. Will we see humans on the moon before this decade ends? It's looking promising. If you enjoyed this look into moon landing myths and facts, check out our playlist for more space content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for the latest updates and exciting space discoveries. What do you think about the moon landings? Share your thoughts in the comments below.